All right. Hello and welcome. Um, Let me change my audio source real quick before we get too deep. Oh, okay. Am I able to? Can I boot the microphone? It's possible that I can. Let's see, that's the speaker microphone volume. All right, let's turn that up, and then that should be a lot better. Okay, so what I'm going to be going over today is the UiPath tutorial. This UiPath tutorial is going to cover the RE framework in specific. I have a lot of experience with the RE framework, 4 years to be exact, dealing with UiPath RE framework. I've programmed in VB and C Sharp both. Today we're going to be using Visual Basic, but I mean, a lot of the principles are the exact same. There's little functionality that has been lost. This is a very basic tutorial, but I will be covering a little bit more advanced topics in the future. Let me share my screen. Okay. So this is the RE framework. The RE framework is basically a state machine. A state machine has a start node and an end node, um, or at least an end state. The start node specifies that, this is where it starts, and then it has an arrow. It has to have an arrow that points to a specific state. Your states have what are called transitions. So that's what these arrows specify. And you can actually dig into these in the states, what type of transitions are going to be available. So if you wanted your, you know, this is completely modular. If you wanted your state machine to look completely different, that's totally possible. Um, there are 4 different states given default in the RE framework. Uh, moment. Let me do this real quick. Okay, I can go back to sharing my screen. Sorry. Sure everything's good. Okay, um, so you have 4 different states here at default. You have your initialization state, your get transaction data state, your end process, and then your process transition. Uh, it typically flows something like your init, and then you go to your get transaction data, and then your process, and then it will kind of loop here as long as there's no system exception. And then once there's no more data to be sent here, it'll loop back, say, oh, there's nothing, go to the end process. If for some reason you have an except init state, it'll go to your end process. And if you have a system exception, it'll go back to your init state, ask if it wants to retry. If it does, then it'll retry what was failed. Otherwise, it'll go to your end process. Okay, so that is, in short, the state machine that UiPath gives you by default. This isn't really a tutorial over the IDE itself, more so the RE framework. So if that's something that you want to see me dig into, that's totally cool. We can get into that. But for now, I'm going to stay on topic here. I'm going to try. and go a little bit more into the initialization state. So this is where we start. So you'll see here a bunch of nested sequences. Um, think of these as you know, just kind of like if you're familiar with front end code, think of these like divs, right? You have this div, and then if you wanted to add another sequence, you'll go to your activities and you can drag in another sequence here, and then that would add like another div. So it's really like an organizational piece, but you can also make these private. So from like a actual like programming standpoint, these are more so like classes, right? So you're saying like I want this or not class functions. So I have my load configurations and open applications functions. The only difference is that you know really you don't have to worry about like the scope of these. We'll get more into that later, but let's start with what you're going to see as you go into the init state. So we have our state right here. This is our entry, and then we have our exit. So anything that you wanted to do on exit, this will always be exit init state. And then your transitions. So if it's successful, it goes to get transaction data. And if there's a system exception, it goes to your end process. So these are your destinations. These are the transition states. The um, transitions themselves, right? So those are those little arrows that you would see in your main, right? System exception successful. You can either create, I think you actually create them here. So if you wanted another one, you would have to drag an arrow like that. It defaults to T1. Name it foo condition is some condition. And then if you went here, you'll see foo destination get transaction data. If you wanted to delete it, delete key, or you have to really have to click it though. There we go. Okay. So if you want to delete it, you just have to click it and press the delete key. Very simple. Um, so going into the entry of your initialization state, you have here your system exception. We set that to nothing. We don't want that to trigger the transition to end process, faulty, right? So it's just good to set that to nothing. It's your instantiate or initializing system exception to nothing. We have our first if statement. So if your config is nothing, so this is used, you'll see there's like a whole bunch of stuff here below. So your consecutive exceptions, and then your init all applications. This is used for very good reasons. So in your config, if it is nothing, so this config is actually a dictionary. You'll see here, dictionary of string and object. So let me pull up a sticky note. It's fine. Your dictionary right now is config. So your let's say config is dictionary, and currently config is nothing, right? So currently config, when you first start the automation, the config is nothing. I believe that is not here, so it is nothing. Okay. You can set the primary resolution of the screen, and that's irrelevant to you, but these are just some log messages. Your init all settings. So your init all settings is where we actually initialize your config, right? We set it to something. So we pass in the config file that's default in your project. We have our config sheets, and then we have our variable being passed out, or well, our not our property, but yeah, our parameter being passed out. So it will return a config dictionary, which will it's out here, and now our config will not be nothing once this is completed. Let's talk a bit about the in config right here, the in config file. This is a string. It's passed in like that. This is located in your data folder right here. So your config.xlsx. Let's open that up and take a look at the config and get a little bit more in depth. So you'll see here right off the settings and constants are going to be listed here in sheets. If you have more sheets that you would like to add, for instance, if you wanted to add I've seen this quite a few times, I rename this sheet to, I'm going to update Office right now. So let's rename this sheet to exceptions. And then here we have to set our headers. So we'll say exception message. Right, and now we'll have BRE001 and then system, what do you call it? Application exception. So AE, XAE, so application exception, or SAE for system application exception 001. Here, let's just say we'll just say application business rule exception. So that's the acronym for BRE, business rule exception. Occurred, can't spell, whatever, doesn't matter. System application exception occurred. Okay. So if we wanted to add our exceptions sheet to have been read to our config file, we have to add that here. Exceptions, make sure my spelling's right. Okay, good. So now we've added that. Let's make this bold, just like you would find here. Actually, 14 Calibri bold under 14. Cool. Okay, so moving on. It'll read your settings sheet first. So this is where you'll have your queue name, queue folder. If you choose to use that, for this instance, let's set our queue name, and we'll set up our queue later. So this is just queue. Let's call this video tutorial queue name queue. And then the folder is some folder that we'll have to set up later. You can add more things here to your settings. So for instance, if you wanted this automation to only run, let's see. Trying to think of a good reason to put a set. Like, okay, so for if some reason you had a second queue, or if you needed a file already present and available in order for the automation to run, you could put like a file path here. But in my opinion, I don't really like putting file paths in the config file, because those I'd rather put them in the assets. So honestly, I don't really use too much. I would rather put that in some of these things in the constants page. So for instance, well, okay, this is a good one. So if you had a URL that the automation, this is kind of the confusing part. It's really up to you where you want to put it. I like putting them in the constants page because typically these things don't change. So if you had a URL that you wanted to navigate to, URL HTTP URL, and then you could put a description here. Don't even know if I spelled that right. So it reads it like that. So the name that you use, the value, and then the description, you're going to see here name, value, description, and then there is no name value description. It's just going to be exception message. You could do name value. That's perfectly fine. In fact, I'm going to leave it like that. Description here. So we're going to keep things consistent. And then your assets is just going to be your name, asset, orchestrator asset folder, and then description. So this is a little bit different here, the assets, but we'll dig into that in a minute. So you have your settings, your constants, and your exceptions. Those are our sheets. And then your output variable. As we dig into this workflow, we have a log here. We have our config that's going to be set to a new dictionary of string object. You have to do this for any type of data structure. So if you were to have like a list or a dictionary or a hash set or a hash map or any type of complex data structure, you want to have that initialized just out config equals new dictionary of string object. Or whatever it may be. So if this was a list, it would be, let's say we had a list, we could say list foo equals new list of integer. So we had a list of integers. That's how you would do that. You would have to do that. If you tried to assign something without doing it to that, it will throw an exception. Okay, so for each config sheet, so it reads the config sheets, and then we have our item name of each sheet. So that is the object that is pointing to our sheet. We will read the config sheet. So it reads the entire sheet. Here in our properties panel, you'll see that it does add headers. And then for each row of the config sheet, so it sets it to our data table that we set here. So now we have a data table of settings and constants. I'll close this and I will debug it and we can watch it in real time. Set a breakpoint there. Okay, so going into our settings, dictionary is null. And once we do that, now it's to an actual dictionary of string object. Okay. Then here we have our sheet. We should now see that somewhere. Sheet is settings. So that's the current string that it's passed in. So it's going to read our settings sheet from the config. So now we should see a data table variable pop up here. So right now it's null. And now it's full of stuff. So we have our data table. It's going to read each row. So for each row in our data table, if the row is not empty, because we don't want to read, empty rows, doesn't really do anything. And if the name is not nothing. So we have to make sure that we put a name in. If at least put a name in if the value is going to be blank, because sometimes I do that instead of having variables passed out globally and have a whole bunch of variables going back and forth. I would rather just set it in the config. However, that does come with a caveat because it can make troubleshooting and debugging a bit more cumbersome. So you just have to be aware of that if that's a route that you do take. So here we will set the value of our dictionary. So we go is pointing to the row here that we're currently in our data table. So we have our out config, and then this is our key. Our key is the row name, right? So we're setting our key to the row name. Let me pull up. We're actually done reading. the config, so I can pull that back up for you. Value, hence the header value. Really makes sense, very intuitive. So our key is going to be this, and then our value is going to be that. So for the first thing, we should see the key in our dictionary be orchestrator queue name, and the value be video tutorial queue. Let's see if that's what happens. There it is, orchestrator queue name, video tutorial queue. It's going to do that for every single thing. So we should see orchestrator queue folder, and then log f business process name, which is something we'll get into later. Don't worry about what it is, but we have three objects. I mean, three keys: orchestrator queue name, queue folder, process name. Perfect. So we'll exit the loop. I have it open. It's fine. We'll just close it and retry it. So now it's going to read the next sheet. The next sheet. Oh. Oops. I should have known better. Step into the point there, and then we'll set a breakpoint. So we're going to read the sheet. We're going to click continue. So we're back to where we were. We have our three items. Now it's going to read the constants page. So if I click continue, well, actually, I might not need to do that. So now we have our constants and our settings read into our dictionary. So you'll see there, these are things that we haven't seen, unless you were really paying attention. URL, HTTP URL. So yeah, that's kind of a way to get around having a whole bunch of variables clogging up your panels while still having them easily accessible in the project and readable. Okay, so now we also read our exceptions page. I forgot about that. So we have SAE 001 system exception card. So we have our data table, our dictionary fully filled out, except for the assets page. The assets a bit special. Probably, I don't know if, let me set this up real quick. Okay, so here's my personal workspace. This is something called your orchestrator. This is what you're going to want to use. So here we have some processes. This comes default with Hello World. But if you wanted to add things, this is where you do it. So your asset, in your orchestrator. And I think this should be a separate tutorial, but just know that your assets are where you should store things that are likely to change, that should be outside of the project. For instance, if you had to send an email to somebody to let them know that the automation has needed, that individual's email should be stored in the as an orchestrator asset. Okay. I don't know how this is. I don't know if that's going to throw an exception or just not do anything. I haven't, because I have not set it up. Okay, didn't throw an exception. So if the queue name is not specified, then it'll set the queue name via here. What it means by that is the queue name can also be set in your arguments to your main. So this will be available via UiPath Assistant. Back to my live stream. So it doesn't go in. Then here you have your queue folder is set, so it does the same thing for your queue folder. It is already good. Here is your kill all processes. So it kills all Windows processes representing applications used in the business process to assure that the execution starts in a clean state. Since the applications are assumed to be already closed, close all applications is skipped and kill all processes is invoked. So kill all processes is what happens when it first starts out. It will not that occurs. Kill all processes is it's okay. If you're using an attended automation, people typically don't like all of their applications killed. I typically run it in, I try to make it, where is it? Picture in picture. If you're going to do something like that, and then kill all processes kind of moot because you're starting on applications open. It's kind of irrelevant for me. Times commented out, but it can be useful for that where somebody might not have uh, killed all the processes for some reason, or maybe they hopped on the bot to see what's going on, right, the server. All right. Moving on, max consecutive system exceptions. So if the same system exception occurs twice, this is where that will happen, and it'll throw an exception which will end the process. This is to prevent the same exception from happening. Let's say you wanted it to retry 10 times. You can set this to 3, because if it's just not getting past it, then that's something that needs to be looked at by the maintainer, the selector of whatever you used, if it was an application, the logic of whatever you used, if it was more logic based or something in Excel. Init all applications. I'm going to go ahead and stop this. It's irrelevant now. Init all applications is going to be passing in your and whatever else you may need. So if we wanted to open up Edge and then or Chrome, whatever you prefer, and navigate it to where the automation will start. So like if you wanted to, I don't know, automate something that logs into a finance application or something like that for the automation. This is where you would open it in Edge, and then personally, I like to be signed in before I move on in the process, right? Another thing that you have to add is here. I usually add it before. Well, actually, usually I have this commented out if I'm being honest. So here, I will have a sequence, and then I will load my queue or data table. So we'll rename this activity, this sequence to load data table. And then here, this is where you could put a like read range workbook. Let's say you needed to read range of some workbook and for finance, and each row needed to be processed. So like, let's say you had to download some kind of invoice or something like that for each row in the data table that has a specific number to it. This is where you would read each row, or well, you would read it as a data table, and then you could then have that just be, your DT transaction data. What you have to do to convert it to a data table is have it's going to yell at me because I don't have anything here. This is where you would set that. So you would read it, read range there, and then let's say we wanted to filter out the data table where we're going to remove rows where it's empty, right? Where the column name is empty. Let's say where the invoice number, right? So if the invoice number is empty, it'll remove the rows, and you can actually create a new data table, or you can use the same one. So like DT transaction data. So you can pass in and out the same one. You can also set that here, right? Dot remove. But you do have to go into the config filter in order to utilize it properly. Okay. So that's something that manually has to be added. If you did want to use a queue, this is where you would do your add queue item activity. Your add queue item is a little bit different. So you'll put in your orchestrator folder path, the queue name that you used, and then the item information. So for instance, if we just wanted to process, let's say 3 invoices that match some kind of regular expression, and we have variables set to have like invoice 1, yeah, you could have some loop where you then loop through the invoices that match the regular expression, and then we could just say like current item, right? So that then the target of that for each loop of the invoices that match will be passed in, and then you could have like whatever you want. The item could be your variable, and then your key can be like invoice number, and that is then going to be like consistent, right? So your queue item is very, it's really interesting how that works, but I'm not going to get too deep into. This is just about the RE framework, right? So assuming that we have our queue item, it'll hit the exit, so it'll say we are exiting the init state. I believe it said it. No, it didn't because I closed it. Assuming that it is successful, it'll go to the get transaction data state. So let's click it. Boom. So the get transaction data state is right here. It's the middle one. It checks the should stop signal. This is given out by orchestrator. This is going to be like if your automation is set to should stop after 15 minutes, it'll check. If it's been 15 minutes, the orchestrator will send out. I think this is like a Boolean, if I'm not mistaken. It would make sense. Yeah, it's a Boolean. So then orchestrator will send out this, and it'll say like true, please stop. So if it should stop, then it'll set the transaction item to nothing, where then it will say, okay, now if the transaction item is nothing, there's no data in the process. If the transaction item, or if should stop is false, then it will go to the get transaction data. Get transaction data takes in several arguments. The transaction number is important, the config is important, transaction item is important, and then these are more so for logging. And this is your data table that we're passing in. So we pass in the data table. This is also using a queue. So it's actually kind of confusing why they do that. If they're going to put in queues, leave it as queues. I suppose that they're like, hey, we have both, but I think for newbies, it can be really confusing. It's going to go into a retry scope. So the retry scope has retry intervals and then the number of retries. So retry number, get transaction item, right? So that's going to be set in your config. If you wanted it to try to get a transaction item more than once, then that's where you would set that there. This triggers anytime an exception occurs. So if some kind of exception happened right here, forget transaction, could not retrieve it, rethrow, and then it'll go here. And if it's, let's say it's set to 2 and it retried it 0 times, it'll retry it again. An exception occurs. Now it's retried it once, twice, it fails again, and then it leaves and it throws that exception. So yeah. It'll try to get the transaction item. So if it is a queue item, then this is all you need. However, if it is a data row that you're using, this is where you will utilize the in transaction number to specify the row that we are currently on. Okay, so that's where you would say like in an assign activity, you would go like assign out transaction item, which is set as a queue item. See what I mean? If it's passing in a data table, why is it setting out as a queue item? If you're using a data table and you want to use that and not a queue, then this would need to be a data row variable in your system.data. So that's where we'll set that. And then you would set that to IODT transaction data. And then if you wanted it to be the entire row, then you would just do dot rows of in, I think it's transaction number. Yeah, in transaction number. Oh, because it's a queue item. We have that set to a data row. So this might happen. So when this does happen, you just Control X, Control V, and if it's still yelling at you, then you just get rid of the value. And now it's just going to say it was not supplied. Paste it. Out transaction item data row. That doesn't make any sense. I don't know why that's happening. That's just a weird bug, but that's how you would do it. So if it was at these items, so if you have an ID that you want to give it or transaction field, so some kind of property, like for instance, if you wanted the invoice number, then you could set that to the invoice number of the data row. So you could see be like out transaction item, which specifies the column, and then put the column name. You could put that there, and then that will be your transaction field 1, and so on and so forth. Else, do nothing. So that's it. That's your transaction data. Its whole entire purpose of transaction data, get transaction data workflow, is to spit out a either queue item or a data row that you're going to use in your process. If it is nothing, then obviously it will be no data, which is in your if statement. So you'll see here, if transaction item is not nothing, goes to new transaction item. Otherwise, if transaction item is nothing, then it goes to no data. So that's just an if statement there, right here. This is just an if. If this, then that. If this, then that. So suppose we do have a to process. Let's say our transaction item is this. We'll go like this. We'll say it's our data row looks like this. So we have the invoice number. These are the headers, invoice number and URL. So invoice number 1, URL, HTTPS, ... This would be our transaction, our transaction data, which is of the data row type. So we have to specify the column that we're using. So so let's start from the top here. We have our process state. This is our entry, and we have our exit. So again, you could do something here. Your system exception goes to the initialization state. Your business exception goes to get transaction data. A business exception, for instance, is if the let's say, for instance, this URL is supposed to be populated here, and for some reason it's not. Let's say the user has to put that in before the automation runs. That would be a business exception, right? A business rule exception where the URL is not present. So we don't want to retry that. So we're not going to call that a system exception. We're going to call that a business exception. That's the difference between the two. Whereas if you navigated to this URL and it was unable to find the button that it needed to click, even though it is present, that's a system exception. Okay. On success, it goes back to get transaction data. So these two go back to the same thing. They just say, okay, move it on, next. So we have our business exception. We set that to nothing. Our system exception is set to nothing already. We did that in the init state. If you remember, that was the first thing that happened. And then we have our process workflow. So our process workflow by default takes in a transaction item, which is, in this case, it would be a data row. And then you can't set it out here, but I'm just showing you. It'd be a data row, and then our config. In here, to start the process, all you have here is a log message and then the invoke steps of the process. So this is where it would navigate to the URL, download the report, put it into the folder, move on to the next item, right? The bulk of what is happening, right? The reason that they want you to do this should go here, right? Things that take time is where you want to put this. You don't want to spend all your time doing init. You don't want to go there, navigate to the URL that of the transaction item in your init all applications, right? That just seems counterintuitive. That doesn't really, that's not initialization. That's kind of digging a bit deeper than you should. So here, if we wanted to get the queue item, then for a queue item, you would say, and I'm just showing you the functions, you would specific content. So you would say specific content, and if we had, let's say our headers are the names of the queue item that we put in. So we would just say invoice number. So it'd be like that as a string, invoice number. And in fact, if you really wanted to go super extra, you can always use the config instead of these hard-coded hard-coded strings. Personally, I think this is fine. The developer's setting this, so it's like, whatever. And then you have to remember it's returning an object. So if you wanted that to be a string, make sure you specify .toString function. This is what it looks like. Exacerbated. There's a lot more functions as well. So you can get assigned to, defer date, due date, ID, item key, but I've never used that. There's a whole lot of stuff you can really use here. You can get the queue name, the status, the transaction time, row version, all that stuff. Retry number. It's crazy. I generally content though. If you're getting the transaction, so if your transaction item is a data row, just go ahead and change that to a data row. And to get the invoice number, we would use specific content. We would use item. And then that would specify the column, right? So you see there, column name as string. So we'd put the column name of the data row in order to get that number 1, in order to get 1. Okay, so that's the process. Assuming that you went through and did exactly what you needed to do, and it was a success, then it will set the transaction status success. So notice here it says success, and then this one should say BRE. This one should say SE. So these are different, but they're also the same. It's all the same workflow, and they all take in the same arguments. That is kind of annoying because you now have to, if you have a data row, then your transaction item is going to have to be a data row. Is what it is. Easy to do, though. You just got to make sure you change them in all 3 locations or it'll yell at you. So you want to make sure you put that as a data row whenever you do that. If it is successful, then it'll go to the success workflow. So this is actually called a flowchart. So you'll see here this takes in a condition if business rule exception is nothing. So if there's no business exception or system exception, then it goes to success. If it's not, then it goes here and it checks if the business exception is not nothing. So if the business exception is something, then it's a business exception. If it's not a business exception and it wasn't successful, then it can only be a system exception. So it goes there. And then this increments the transaction number, the transaction index, and resets, retries, all that stuff. The max consecutive retries would be reset here too. So everything that like keeps track of system exceptions and how many times it's actually retried is usually reset here. In the success sequence, we have an if statement. So if the transaction item is not nothing, so if the transaction item is something, and also if the transaction item is a queue item, then it sets the transaction status. So this is something that you don't have to worry about. Even though the transaction item is a data row, like let's say it was a data row, I think this would yell at you. Yeah, so it would yell at you. So I really don't understand why they put this if statement here in the default. Personally, I just, right here, hotkey Control D, comment it out. If you're using a data row, whoops, Control E, Control E, okay. If it's queue item, then it's already done for you. Yeah. And then it will log the success and then remove the log fields for the current transaction item. So that will be your ID, your number, everything that it's currently doing is going to be reset. Everything that you set your get transaction data, I should say. So this is your business exception. This does basically the same thing where it sets the item to failed because there's only failed and successful. Because even though it was expected, so like, you know, it's what I call expected, but even though like it had no way to process this and it's not a fault of the automation, it still fails the transaction item, right? It wasn't successful in doing what it was trying to do. So that still needs to get set to failed, but that's it. It's very very similar. This one, on the other hand, is different. So it'll assign the queue retry. Again, it's going to at you if it's a data row, so I don't really know why it's here. It's going to be stuff that they really push queues on you, but then they set some stuff as data rows. It's odd. Takes a screenshot. So this is a workflow that's in here. Typically, I don't like screenshots. I don't really need them. If you're really good at logging, you shouldn't need a screenshot. But hey, to each their own. You can store your screenshots here in your exception screenshots folder. That's where it stores it. I'm not going to get into it. I never mess with it. You have it or you don't. For me, it's either I disable it or it's there and I have my exception screenshots here in the folder. It's nice for debugging, but when I move stuff out to production and it's running on a bot or an attended bot, I don't like to have it up there because it's just going to put files in their their folders that they don't have access to anyways or nowhere to find it really. So it's irrelevant for attended. The transaction item is a queue item. So if it's a queue item, then it's going to do the queue retry stuff where it sets the transaction item to failed and then increments the retry number. So it assigns that to that. Else, nothing. So, yeah. Here, it increments the counter of consecutive exception retries, consecutive system exceptions. So that'll be 1. And then it'll go from 1 to 2 to 3 to whatever you set it. So this is retry current transaction workflow. This is important to go into. This is for the queue items, and I know this is a beefy flowchart, but just read these, right? Retry transaction, no, then log, no retries, and then it sets the transaction item, the transaction number to play. So if you want automation to skip over the current invoice because maybe sometimes it just breaks, right? And instead of having it retry, and then fail out, you want it to completely ignore it because it might be a one-time thing. And then, this is where you can mess with that a little bit in your settings. I wouldn't really ever mess with this, but one thing to note though is the local retries. So this increments your transaction number, orchestrator retries, and then it's kind of clustered. Increment retry counter. So let's continue going down the line, right? If there is no retry, then it just increments the transaction number to the next one. So we're just moving down the line, right? We would go from this one to HTTPS. So it would go from 1 to 2 in your queue items, right? It would move on. If the retry transaction item is set to true, so if the retry number is greater than 0, basically, we check, have the max retries been reached? Let's say no, first off. Let's just say no. Then we log retry, and then we ask, do we want to use orchestrator retries? So this is something like, basically, have you set this, right? So this is yes, and then this is no. Lower that down. I really don't know why they did that. There, that's better. Try to make it neat, and it just looks confusing. So if we want to use orchestrator retries, then we set our transaction number equal to the transaction number plus 1. So we increment the transaction number for the orchestrator retry. Otherwise, if we're not using orchestrator retries, then we set our retry number to plus 1. So it's saying, like, are we using the settings that we locally have, or are we just going to let UiPath Orchestrator deal with it? Personally, I'm a control freak, so I never really use Orchestrator retries. Sometimes, I shouldn't say never, I rarely use them, but that is something to know. So have the max retries been reached? Yes, then we set our retry number to 0, and then we set our transaction number to plus 1. Simple as that. Personally, me, I like having things point to the same thing. Like, I hate having duplicates, but it's whatever. Item. Close all applications. So it's going to close any applications that you want to close right here. If you wanted to close, let's say you're using Chrome and you're in the website, and the website is just unable to click it for some reason, or it thinks it clicked it and it really didn't, so it's trying to do the next thing, but it's stuck on the previous. This is where it'll close the browser, right? So that's just to know. Like, let's say it does close the browser and kind of move on as if it did have a system exception. So it went to system exception. It'll kick out here. It'll do the exact same thing that we just talked about. So it'll kick it out, close all applications. We have retry set, so it is going to retry the item, and it'll kick back to the destination initialization. So in the initialization, we do have a config. So it'll go into here, and then it'll go here, set the system exception to nothing, and then it will ask, is the config nothing? No, it's not nothing. So it skips over that. Then it checks if the max consecutive retries have been reached. So if you have that set to 1, it's kind of redundant. You should have just set it to not retry. If you have to max consecutive exceptions, like let's say it's 2, so you want it to retry it once, and if it happens again, then you want it to throw hard and quit out. then that's where that would happen. Otherwise, it goes into the init alt applications, and that's where it goes back in and logs you in, and then it retries the transaction item. So that's kind of the nicety of that, right? That kind of helps you understand why I don't like too much in my init alt applications. I like to go to where it needs to go and log in, right? If that's where it needs to go in init alt applications, or open the let's say you're using Salesforce, it'll open Salesforce and log in if it's not logged in for some reason. I don't know. Usually people have SSO, so it's single sign-on. Going back to the process, assuming that it didn't fail and it goes to get transaction data and we've run out of queue items or data rows, it'll say no data and go to your end process. So your end process here, all it is close all applications. If it fails, then it kills all processes. You have a pip session, it's going to close the pip session, which closes the applications inside of it. So it's kind of, it is a bit overkill, but if you're having an unattended automation, then sure, that's fine. That being said, whenever you close all applications, you're going to want to make sure that you're not using this activity. The kill process activity. So if you wanted to kill Edge or Chrome, I'll open up Chrome. So let's say we wanted to kill Chrome. Process name, I think it's just maybe current user. And then I think it's just Chrome. But it might be .exe. Not sure. Let's see if it closes. Yep. Okay. So then that kills the process. If I opened up Chrome again, see there, restore, right? So that means that it killed the process. I don't like doing that. I like to try to close it gracefully before I kill the process. That being said, kill it if you want. I mean, it's up to you, man or woman. If there's an exception, it'll try to kill it. And then finally, so it'll terminate the main workflow. So if there's something you wanted to do before that, I would recommend leaving this last, right? So if you wanted to send like send like an email or something like that, you could put that above here. So you could drag a sequence in here and rename this like, end process sequence, send out, send automation completion email. You can do whatever you want here, whatever you need to do, right? Let's say you like your company wants you to delete any files on the on the bot that it shouldn't store anything. Then you can delete files downloaded. So like if you copied the files from your downloads folder to its destination on like either a shared drive or actually just sent them via Outlook or whatever you choose, whatever you need to do, this is where you can delete those files from your downloads folder, right? Okay, and that's pretty much it. That is the ReFramework. Very versatile, has its quirks, but really useful. I hope you found this useful, and leave a comment or something like that if you have anything that you want me to go over or in more depth. Thanks, and I hope you have a great day.